This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today on my show, I'm discussing the founder's mentality, how to overcome the predictable crisis of growth. Sounds a little academic? Not so fast. The founder's mentality is something that we all need to have if we're going to try and have success. Bottom line, there is no way around it. The authors, Chris Zook and James Allen. And today on my show, I have Chris Zook, one of those authors. Chris is with Bain Capital and brings decades of really great frontline experience. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Chris Zook discussing the founder's mentality. So Chris, what I want the audience to understand first, give me the elevator pitch on the founder's mentality. Once I have that, I want to go backwards. I want to understand your process. What was the triggering moment for you to go down this path and the research process? And then over the next hour, we can kind of backfill and tear apart and add more flesh to this. But I really want to know how you got started in it. But the audience is going to need to know what it is first.
The work that led to the founder's mentality probably began about 5 years ago, when we decided to drill down into the question of what is it? What are the deep root causes that allow some companies to stay young, stay energetic, be sustainable in their performance over time, big companies and small companies, in a world where so many businesses now age prematurely. In fact, only 1 in 10 companies achieves even a modest level of sustained and profitable growth over as little of a time as a decade. And so we began to drill down into that. We came across one amazing statistic. And the amazing statistic is that if you look at the performance of all public companies and you separate them into two piles, one pile where the founder is still involved as CEO or very involved as a board member or deeply involved in some other way, in all other companies, you find that the ones where the founder's presence is still looming and strong has performance that is about 3.1 times, it's an amazing amount more, 3.1 times higher returns than all the other companies where that is not true. We began to say, what is it, given how varied founders are, what is the common thread among those businesses? And it could be, or organizations, frankly. It doesn't have to be a business. It could be a nonprofit like Endeavor. As we pursued that, we realized that there were a few ways that the great founders were consistent about how they built their companies on the inside to endure and be sustained. You know, there are hundreds of things you could do on the inside, but we found 3 in particular. And those 3 elements, which are sort of attitudes and behaviors that we saw in the most sustainable, successful founder companies, are what we called the founder's mentality.
What was the process, though? So you start to have this hypothesis, perhaps. You know the direction that you want to go, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you let the data lead you completely. What was the path that you went down? I mean, how many people did you talk to? Talk about the process of going to meet with firms and leaders and staff. How did that all unfold?
We triangulated at this question of the roots of sustained performance, the deep inner roots of sustained performance in 3 or 4 different ways, and all the paths led to basically the same outcome. One, we did a survey of nearly 350 executives around the world today, and we asked them what were their major barriers to profitable growth. We looked at the most successful companies among those, the less successful companies among those, and we found a handful of themes that were massively more profound in the companies that were most successful by a factor of about 5. We then went out into the world, and we set up a group called the Developing Market 100 that we now call the Founders Mentality 100. And these were companies that are maybe 100 million, 500 million, maybe larger in some cases, $1 billion, that were growing and aspired to become much larger. We held forums in about 9 of the developing markets around the world of these CEOs and founders. We talked to them about the barriers that they faced in their growth trajectories. We looked at the consistent things that they did to surmount those predictable barriers. Then a third thing we did is we went to the database that we built of about 8,000 companies around the world in all the public markets. We built it for about 25 years. We identified the best performing companies over the last 10 years and over the last 20 years. We drilled down into the attributes of those businesses, particularly as related to, we took a subset of 200 and really tore them apart. And that led to a similar set of characteristics about how they were built on the inside. And then the final thing we did is we went out and talked to maybe 100 CEOs and founders that we felt were representative of either renewing their companies really successfully, like Jorgen Knudstorp at Lego, one of the great turnarounds, or Kent Thiry at DeVito, who basically refounded what is now the most well-performing healthcare company in the world, or Michael Dell, one of the great iconic founders who's gone through different waves of running Dell, coming back recently again. We just talked to them for an hour or longer and asked them more open-ended questions about how they built their business to be sustainable. Les Wexner was, an example of a person who's the longest-running CEO founder in the world of a major company. L Brands is actually the best-performing public company in shareholder returns for the last 35 years. And he, for example, was very articulate on this topic, as were many others. And all of them led, in one way or another, to these 3 elements of the founder's mentality. I guess one final thought is in the context of looking at the barriers to companies being successful. We then found something else that I thought was kind of amazing. We found that now 85% of executives in the average company say their biggest barriers and challenges that they worry about the most to achieving sustained performance are internal. And in fact, the largest companies, 94% were. It's like the best-selling sports book in the world over the last few decades has been The Inner Game of Tennis. And people read it in all sports, from recommended for the Seattle Seahawks by Pete Carroll and for others. And I think in a way, this is like the inner game of business. Most external breakdowns in sports often and in business trace to deep inner root causes that were pre-existing. So that was basically the method we followed, the main sources of information. What was interesting is that all the roots led to a similar set of conclusions.
Ideas are a dime a dozen, but it comes down to execution and passion, doesn't it?
An enormous amount of it comes down to energy and focus and attention to detail. And so if you look at the 3 elements of the founder's mentality, those certainly are elements that are sort of analogous in a way with the words that you just said. One is a very deep sense of insurgency, and what makes you special as an organization. It's what attracts millennials now to jobs and keeps them in their jobs and keeps them thinking about their job rather than what they're going to do next or what they're going to do, that night. And yet, over time, companies turn into just another company, just another bank, just another insurance company, and are not inspiring. So, I think that would be one. And the other elements of the founder's mentality, the second element was what we call frontline obsession, a love of what is happening in the details of the business, which is so central to the great founders and their success. And there are just so many iconic stories of Ray Kroc at McDonald's, studying the detailed thickness of hamburgers endlessly and writing dissertations on that and just being obsessed with what the perfect trade-off for that was. Or, the founder of Wendy's, who would walk into stores and have phrases like, a dirty wash bucket means a dirty floor, and he would literally study whether the wash buckets in the back that cleaned the floors were clean or not. And the third element of the founder's mentality was what we called an owner's mindset, that relates to taking personal responsibility versus being so process oriented that you have many places to hide, and like in huge companies can often avoid responsibility forever. Yes, in a way it comes down to energy and execution and inspiration. The interesting thing about the founder's mentality is what we probed into is, how do you do that? Why is it that organizations that begin with the founder's mentality, every founder has an inspiring mission. Every founder turned the lights on in the morning and was the first salesperson just about. How is it that as organizations age, they age so prematurely and they lose these things that made them great?
I was just thinking about when you gave that initial 3 times figure, and we can look at the last, this is several years ago now, but when everyone knew that Steve Jobs was going to die, I was probably one of those people that just assumed, well, the operation, there's some very smart people there. He wasn't the only guy. And not that there's been a tremendous drop off in performance or anything, but I think there's rightfully, when you look at your work, rightfully a lot of fear when you start to have this founder's mentality, and especially when you throw that 3 times figure out there. In hindsight, rightfully, everybody should have been extremely frightened as Apple shareholders that Steve Jobs was not going to be around. The data says that, doesn't it?
It does. We took the 3.1 times 15-year performance figure difference, a pretty amazing gap between those where the founders somehow involved in all of their companies. People did say, well, of course, that's just Apple. That's just Facebook and Google and a handful of explosive companies from Silicon Valley, Amazon. So we stripped all those out. And even then, it was still 2.6 times based on companies like Nike, where, Phil Knight has been deeply involved on the board all along, or L Brands with Les Wexner. But I think what's interesting is that, to some degree, the founder's mentality is learnable and can be maintained even after the founder is gone. There are so many great examples of companies that lost the founder's mentality and then got it back by a CEO like Bob Iger in the case of Disney, coming in to revive Disney and really rediscovering many of the things that made Disney great in the first place. He bought Pixar and Marvel, even went back and bought the rights to some of the original first old characters from the early cartoons, made animation front and center again, created a new repeatable model around computer animation. It has been, a huge public issue about how to find somebody to replace Bob Iger, who brought back the founder's mentality at Disney. Of course, though, he was not the founder himself, but, he reignited it based on an insurgent mission around rejuvenating the original core, and a love and focus on the details and pushing decisions down to the frontline developers and making the people who are making the movies the heroes again. So it is learnable, even in the absence of the founder, but it is fragile, as we saw in the case of Starbucks a few years ago, for sure.
You've mentioned him several times already, Les Wexner, The Limited, Victoria's Secrets, right? I've got a great quote that I jotted down from your work, and this is from Les. Quote, "I refuse to accept the fact that I am mature or that the business is mature. As soon as you accept that, you begin to die," end quote. That is a really strong statement that probably causes some business people to kind of recoil in horror. Like, why is this guy at the top of the heap still talking like that? But that's the essence of what your work is all about. You have to stay like that or it doesn't work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The essence of what it's all about is, the other great Les Wexner quote is, he said, in his younger years this is true, but he still feels the same way. And he said he wakes up in the morning and he still has in the back of his mind the idea that a bear is chasing him He has these other quotes, such as, when you stop to smell the roses is when you can start to get run over. And, I'm reminded by, another great founder, late Andy Grove, in his book, Only the Paranoid Survive. It doesn't mean you have to live in a gnawing, anxiety-laden world of deep paranoia. No. But it does mean that you really have to keep your eyes open and be open-minded and be willing to adapt your company to change rather than fighting the future. Some of the great founder-led companies reshaped companies in the world that, fought the future and failed to stay open-minded and become short-term oriented. And I think a great thing about people like Les Wexner is they have been more focused on what they are building for the long term than, the micro short term. And second, that as the company even has become large, 95,000, maybe 100,000 employees now, there's an ethos of focus on and love of the details and of getting the leaders out into the front line. You find so often a sign of companies getting arthrosclerosis is when the decisions in a company, as it becomes larger and more layers and becomes more bureaucratic, the decisions begin to move to people who may never have served a customer, may never have worked in the factory, are the thinkers, often, very smart, well-educated, business school staff people in corporations who are not necessarily the doers. The companies that stay lean keep the decisions with the doers more than the thinkers, and avoid the energy vampires that creep in to large corporations are the ones that stay youthful even as they get large. You can't avoid getting large, really, to be successful ultimately. The danger of size is complexity, and complexity is the silent killer of growth.
Have you found, since you've put your work out, have you found pushback? Have you found people that have said, well, Chris, I'm not really sure it's that direction, or have you found a pretty universal embrace with the direction that you are educating on?
Well, this is the fifth book I've written on the topic of different angles of how companies perform over the last 12 years. And of all, and they've been all with Harvard Press, and they've all done well in their own genre. But this one is by far the one that has received the most positive energy. All the reviews have been positive. Everything posted on Amazon has been 4 to 5 stars, and all of the talks that I've done have had a slightly higher level of energy around the discussion at the end, where people could have stayed for hours talking about it. And I've asked myself, why is this? And I think one thing is that this comes at business through the right brain. And the right brain is the side, as we see so often in politics and in the world, of emotion. The right brain is what people are engaging in these founders' mentality issues because they can just feel in their bones companies they've interacted with where they're handed from one person to another as a customer like a hot potato. Or they can visualize places their children are working where they're just, frustrated desk jockeys in a cubicle and are one of the many people, and only 13% of Americans say they have any inspiration in their job or think the company is special at all. And I think that's really, really unfortunate. So I think the reason for this higher level of acceptance and emotional engagement is because of that. I maybe in a way it's obvious. These 3 points are obvious, but they're very hard to do. Just like, the 5 elements of Ben Hogan's prescription for a good golf swing are all pretty obvious in a way when you read them, but each one is somewhat hard to do. And to do them all at once while, under performance pressure is unbelievably hard, as we know. And I think it's true of these elements of the founder's mentality. They look clear, but they're very hard to do.
Let me dig a little bit on each of these the 3 parts. As I think about the frontline obsession, this deep understanding of what customers want right there on the front line, I can think to a steak and cheese place in the Washington, D.C. area in Arlington, Virginia. It's been around for like 50 years. The two guys there, one makes pizza, one makes steak and cheese. The steak and cheese guy has been at that grill for 50 years. He knows people's orders by memory. They're famous. Now, they obviously have not scaled this thing well, but I think in my mind, as I read your work, it's like, they get that frontline obsession. They get that emotional attachment. And I guess the trick, and I guess, for example, Apple has done it extremely well, as it keeps coming to my head as a great example. But how as a company gets bigger, keeping that obsession, keeping those people on the front line as engaged, even if they can't exactly be the maestro steak and cheese guy that everyone knows by the name Lefty, if the leadership can keep that front line as engaged, and I keep using Apple, but I look at the Apple stores and the people in the Apple stores, generally, you do feel a certain sense of excitement when you go into an Apple store. Maybe it ebbs and flows, but that's a lot of what this is all about, is it's keeping that excitement and keeping customers engaged, and it's all about the emotions at that moment, isn't it?
It is, and it's about having people in the business willing to own the customer experience. We've all had experiences with our failures of our cable boxes or something, where we call the company and we're handed to it one place and then handed to another, and then what they say doesn't work, and then we go back on the phone and we find a completely different person. Whereas your steak and cheese place, just like a restaurant, just came back from living 10 years in Amsterdam, and there was a restaurant around the corner, Mayor, a second-generation Indian restaurant. And over time, they knew what Donna and I were going to order. They gave us a free glass of wine the second we walked in. They would find a table for us even when they were busy, although we, gave polite about recommending things. They would come over, and we got to know their family, and they'd show us wedding photographs, and they knew just how we liked everything presented, and they got to know us better and better and better, and every time the experience was better. And it's completely opposite from the cable business. And yet, there are very large companies that maintain this better than others. I was struck in my own experiences and in our research by, Amazon. Amazon receives on the three major measures of satisfaction and loyalty across all retailers, number one or number two over the last 4 or 5 years from their customers. And how can that be? And one thing is obviously they deliver, not just literally but figuratively, but I think also, if you have a problem and you send an email to an Amazon help desk, the same person stays with you until the end of the problem and it is solved. And you have one person, like in the Apple store when you go in and have someone at the Genius Bar that you can go back to see and who will stay with you until the problem is solved. We found that people who said they were engaged in the business at the front line versus those that said they weren't, and it was just another bank, just another insurance company, just another store, were 5 times more likely to invest their personal energy and time in solving a customer problem, making a special delivery, sending them an email just to check on them, or to offer an innovative idea than those that weren't. It's very powerful to be engaged, to be special. There are these examples of larger companies that, naturally, things do become more impersonal as you move from our Indian restaurant or your steak and cheese place to hundreds of thousands of people like Amazon. But there are a lot of techniques and tricks and role modeling of the leaders that can maintain that versus the opposite. And, the examples of the opposite are like Kafka-esque bureaucracy. And today's world is fast enough that bureaucracies are losing.
Before I go into the sense of insurgency and the owner's mindset, the other two pieces, I think it might be a good opportunity for you to take apart an example that I think people will recall. Not today, because I don't think there's too many people that are using Nokia, not like they did back in the day. But at one point in time, it would have been hard to imagine that Nokia, with the market share they had, the cash in the bank, the name recognition, how they could lose that leadership position. And some people I've seen, people will say, hey, well, other competitors came along and they came up with something better. And then it's just that's the reason Nokia went away. But it's really not that simple, because as you point out in your work, this is a lot more internally driven than it is externally driven. Why don't you talk about some of the lessons that we can all learn from the Nokia experience, specifically their internal choices that perhaps did not work out?
As you say, Nokia in the mid-1990s had everything, every possible thing a company could want. You could even say, to add to your list, that the market they were facing was the largest, most lucrative growth market, cell phones, having a personal computer, supercomputer in your pocket, in the history of the planet. They were giving out dividends at the highest rate ever for a major tech firm, which meant, in some ways, that they didn't know what else to do with the money. They were buying back their own shares at the highest rate of a major tech firm ever, which again says they didn't know what else to do with the money. They had many of the technologies, it turned out, inside for smartphones. They had an engineering group internally that was clamoring to be separated and invested in to create the next generation smartphone. They were the first to do email on the phone. They were the biggest seller of cameras. I mean, think of the use of phones now as a camera. They were by far the biggest seller of cameras in the world. They knew more about that than anyone. They had early touchscreen technology. They had early mock-ups of supercomputers. And the early responses in discussions of what is going on with Nokia were often, well, it's digital, it was the technology choices, they couldn't re-engineer. But subsequently, a lot of books have been written on Nokia, over hundreds of interviews with board members and engineers and current employees and disgruntled employees. And I even, years ago, did a number of interviews at Nokia around a previous book called Repeatability, and saw the same thing. Now it is coming forward that, Nokia had become bureaucratic. It had become a place of warring vertical towers of departments where people were defending the past model against the future. It had become very slow in making its decisions. It had become institutionally closed-minded. When all of that begins to happen, complexity takes over. You can look back and you could say, well, what the company should have done, it's very easy to look back, it's a great luxury, of course, would have been to go to Silicon Valley and set up a separate unit there to create a smartphone where the technology was, and hire hundreds of software engineers because they had more money than any other company around, and to go to reinvent the future and invent the next generation, the next wave. And people were clamoring for this, but they weren't able to break away from Finland, from the conservatism, from the bureaucratic trappings, from the internal disagreements, and make decisions like that. So ultimately, what looked like a technology shift they possibly could not have followed, in retrospect, all the historians are saying actually it was corporate suicide, not competitive homicide. These were self-inflicted wounds that stopped the company from taking its immense research. It had 94% of the profit pool of all handset companies for telephones in the world at one moment. I mean, imagine you couldn't have any more. That's what the business historians and we, now conclude. I think if they had followed the elements of the founder's mentality and been measuring that as a measure of the deep internal health of the organization, possibly Nokia wouldn't be quite where it is now. It would have thought more about its larger insurgent mission. It would have valued creating many founders in the company, which is a great way to keep the founder's mentality growing. It's creating smaller units to pursue their own missions like this one. That just didn't happen.
That gets me to the second part of the founder's mentality, and you just mentioned it at the end there, the sense of insurgency. Why don't you give the audience an example of a company that perhaps, can't use Nokia because they really didn't rebound, a company that had lost their way, perhaps a company that you can reflect on that reclaimed that sense of insurgency, and they reclaimed it and they rebooted the whole thing and came back. Do any come off the top of your head?
I mean, just to bring to life for the listeners what we mean by a sense of insurgency, and then I'll come to an example. most founders probably, again, from your steak and cheese place, which maybe went into business because they felt there wasn't a great steak and cheese place around, to companies, in more global arenas like Elon Musk saying it was SpaceX that one of his goals is to populate Mars with the human species, or Google saying they want to organize all the world's information. These are very inspiring missions. But again, even with the steak and cheese place, you can have a special mission over time, and that's massively important to people because it keeps everybody aligned and it creates energy, and it just does so many things. One of the great examples that probably most of your listeners would relate to easily and be therefore more efficient to use as an example is the case of Starbucks. Starbucks had an insurgent mission to transform the coffee experience, a hugely important daily experience, for most people. And they did that. They took the best of the Italian coffee cafes and blended it with the best of what was being done in Seattle. And Howard Schultz and his team created something really special. But after he left in just a little bit after the year 2000, the company began to move away from what he was building in the long term. They put in machines that were for high productivity. They had a store format that was different and cheaper and faster to put in. And suddenly, out of nowhere, once loyal customers stopped coming. Same-store sales began to go down. Customers' ratings were declining. The stock price, which is so dependent on growth and stability of margin, collapsed 85%. And Howard Schultz was asked to come out of retirement, the founder, take over again as CEO. And he did that. And when he came in, he looked at what was going on. And, you could have a hypothesis that Starbucks was saturated. There were too many of them. People were bored. Its lifetime had gone through. People were drinking tea. Smaller coffee shops were becoming more popular, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what he found was the opposite. He found that the original idea, the original insurgent idea, had been lost. That the baristas who were supposed to be the heart and soul of the experience were now hidden behind these big steel machines, and you couldn't even see their heads. He discovered that in getting marginal sales, they were jamming in products like cheese sandwiches with bad-smelling cheese that, combined with the coffee aroma, was noxious. And it was contaminating in the most, pungent way the coffee experience. And they discovered one thing after another. And his quote and his comment is just so great because he said, what he found, it was a self-inflicted wound, his quote, that it was not one decision or one person, but it was that slowly, as he said, it was like unraveling a sweater inch by inch. The original coffee core of Starbucks was being castrated. He got those machines out. He got rid of the cheese sandwiches. He went back to the store format. He closed the bad ones. He even closed all the stores for a day, thousands of stores, huge cost to retrain all the baristas in the human connection. And you can even see now the products that are coming in are higher-end forms of coffee, cold-pressed coffee, exotic blends of beans. And Starbucks has gone back to its original core, rejuvenated it, and rebuilt around its original insurgent mission. That's just one example. But, you see many, many cases where that's true, whether it was at Apple or whether it's at Home Depot or, in the list, Marvel Comics years ago, the list goes on.
With that example of Starbucks, an amazing story, it's also just absolutely crazy that they had to go back with all of the money, all of the power, all of these very bright people in the operation, besides Howard. They had to go back to Howard because not only did they need that sense of insurgency, but I think it leads us to our third point here, the owner's mindset. And why don't you go into that some too? Because, clearly that was playing a role in Starbucks coming back.
Absolutely. As companies become large and develop layers and become complex, they often become shorter term in their thinking. They focus more on quarterly earnings as opposed to what you're building for the long term. People become more concerned about how they look than really the results in the customers. Customer experiences become balkanized. And I guess the essence of it all is leaders ultimately migrate to being managers, and the managers can migrate to being custodians, and at the worst, custodians migrate to being bureaucrats. When that happens, you really lose the soul of the company. Starbucks had started to slide in that direction. And so what we call the owner's mindset, the third element of the founder's mentality that we found so linked to performance and sustaining it over time, is at its center about taking a deep personal responsibility, like the original founder, for results, not for process. It comes down to a bias to act quickly, to solve problems right away, to have short cycle times rather than to debate them. One of my colleagues recently did a study in a large corporation that had a very big periodic meetings to discuss all their problems. And this is a way to really slow things down than just to have Monday morning meetings, hit the big problems, and move on. And he found that the preparation for this one meeting, the company allowed him to go in and study every calendar and every assignment that was given to prepare for this, quote, decision meeting that happened every 3 or 4 months. It was 300,000 hours. That's more hours than in a small company for every single person. And this is just preparing for one meeting, all the PowerPoint slides, so that people would look as if they had touched every single base, or would look smart, or would look good, or in some cases would help solve the problem. You just don't need to do that. That is a sign of the opposite of the founder's mentality. The great founders were great decision makers, and they would take responsibility quickly. And as companies grow, the energy vampires take over. Decisions move to the center of the organization. I know one company I studied when I was in Amsterdam extensively, and it's one of the largest companies in Europe, and it used to be one of the great innovative companies. And it stalled out for 10 years, 0% organic growth. And to try to fight against that, they began buying founder companies, thinking that would give them, quote, buying growth. And they would buy these companies at huge premiums to the stock market and bring them in. We studied them and sampled them, and we found that every single time they brought them in, they would slow down. They would have to go to, if they wanted to launch a product in India, they would have to go to the corporate center to get brand approval that they were not doing something that was inconsistent with the corporate logo and its mission statement or something. And it was immensely frustrating. And all of these founder companies caught the same disease the corporation had and slowed down. And the company never, after 20 years, has not gotten out of the growth doldrums. The great secret of private equity and its success over the last decades, particularly when it first came in, was, taking companies that had lost the founder's mentality, but particularly lost the owner's mindset, and giving managers a real feeling of responsibility, a real link to the rewards for performance, and turning those companies back into meritocracies as opposed to something else. I think that's the essence of the success of private equity, and it's the essence of the owner's mindset, the third element of the founder's mentality. If you put these three things together, the owner's mindset, a linkage, obsession, frontline obsession, and the existence of a very spiky insurgency that gives people a reason to exist and energy around what they're doing, that's an amazingly powerful health indicator, best indicator we have found at Bain Company in all of our work for the internal health of an organization. When you become unhealthy inside, you begin to lose outside. And usually it begins on the inside. The deep root causes of external failure are, we found 9 out of 10 times, observable and fully present on the inside first.
Well, the way your work is put together, and I found this for myself, you have to question. I mean, it forces like an internal therapy session with anybody that's involved in business, small or large, because you're raising these issues where it's like, If I'm not doing these things every day, we already know that the most successful companies, the most successful entrepreneurs do this. You have done the homework for us. You have assembled the data. And so if myself or somebody else leading another company, if I elect to not do these things, I should understand what my results are going to be.
You know, I can't remember who it was that said this, but I've always found this to be a profound observation, which is that, you know, asking the right question is about 80% of the way towards getting the right solution. You know, I think that these three elements of the founder's mentality give leaders at any level in an organization some weaponry and guidance to really begin to ask the right questions and do a diagnostic and see how far off they are versus what the norm would be. You know, once you get your arms around that, you can do a lot of things. You know, I mean, my own company, which I joined when we had one office and 100 employees. Now we have 55 offices, 10,000 employees. And last year we were voted by Glass Ceiling the best, number one most favored company to work for in America by the young people. And I'm very proud of that. And I've often said, you know, what is it? What is it? Because that's a great result. And what is it? And it is that we've really stayed aware of making sure that everybody had a mini founder experience. That every office, every client, every practice area was built in a way that the people would feel the responsibility and the freedom of a founder in a way. You know, companies that create mini founder experiences can help to keep it alive. And I think the other one other thing that's so important is feedback, open-minded, quick feedback to the front line. We used to do a survey, Bain, of every single team once a month, 7 questions, and it would be like, are we working on the right thing? Is there yield loss? Am I getting feedback from my manager? And even the most junior new analyst would fill it out anonymously, and they would discuss it if there were any results that were not green versus red or yellow or orange. Now, the call became to do it every 2 weeks from the young people and from the teams. And now I just heard we're going to be doing it in many offices every week. And there's nothing like very fast feedback to increase the metabolism of an organization and make the people at the front line feel they're being heard, give them feedback that's honest and open-minded and shows people care. Even as you grow to be large, there are so many things you can do to retain the founder mentality if only you value it appropriately and monitor it and talk about it and think about it and are open-minded.
I think that's a great place as we wind down and end, but I hope people really think about the idea of just what you just said, the mini founder experience, because I firmly believe that every person really, even if they don't know it yet in their life, and maybe they will never know it unless someone leads them there, but everyone really wants to have the mini founder experience, because that's when you get the best out of everybody. When everybody has that sense of ownership. If they don't have this sense of ownership, they might do a great job, they might be a great employee, and they might not even know they want that founder experience. But if they're shown it and they can feel it, then you've got something really special.
Yeah, it's what drives people, I think, to the highest levels of performance, is that personal responsibility and an open-mindedness dominating the inner game. You know, last night I saw Usain Bolt interviewed on television. It was just before he won the sprint. They said, now at this age is the key to your success? And he said, it's inside. It's the mental game. It's maintaining mental toughness all the time through training, maintaining mental toughness through every second of the race. And he said, right now, that's the difference for me and for most of the people out here. You know, it's the same with companies. And when you have mini founder experiences, there is a personal, emotional connection with what you're doing that lets you maintain that mental toughness and keeps you on edge and keeps you willing to act quickly with speed. Companies that lose their mental toughness, they lapse into satisfactory underperformance. That's the beginning. Satisfactory underperformance is the opiate of business.
Chris, Thank you for taking the time today. Most informative. I think that if anybody wants to be, if they're feeling a little, perhaps they're not at the highest point of their game, if they want to be inspired or re-inspired, to get excited, because I think that's what you're really doing is you're challenging us all to go back and think to the first moments of having success and to recapture a lot of that flame, a lot of that ignition. I think that's what it's all about. The book is The Founder's Mentality everywhere on Amazon, you name it. Where else can we send people, if anywhere, Chris, to check you out beyond Amazon?
For larger orders, something like 1-800-CEO-READ. For smaller orders, I honestly would go to Amazon. The book has been published recently in Chinese and in other languages around the world. So I would say your readers, wherever they are, probably the highest, most reliable way to get it is to go online to barnesandnobles.com, amazon.com, or for larger orders for a conference, 1-800-CEO-READ.
Chris, I appreciate it. Hopefully when you get the itch and something else comes out in the future, we can chat again.
I would love that. Anytime. Really appreciate the privilege of being with you today.
I thought it would be fun to include just a few minutes of extra banter between Chris and myself. We got cut off in the middle of our conversation, and when we came back, we sort of went off on a tangent. But I love getting just some of those little insights. You never know until you ask the question, what's coming next? I love doing this podcast for that very reason. That's a lot better. I don't know what happened. I'm calling you from probably about 8,000 miles away. So.
Oh, where are you?
I'm in Saigon.
Wow.
Yeah. So usually it's not that, I've done most of, from my 5 Nobel Prize winners to every fund manager under the planet to every best-selling author. I've generally been in and out of Asia most of the time we've had conversations.
Oh, that's amazing. Are you on vacation or you work in Asia?
I've done all these books on trading, and I got hired 3 years ago by a Hong Kong brokerage firm, CLSA, to go on a speaking tour, mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds, all across Asia, 25 cities. I was living in San Diego. This is supposed to be a 4-month tour. At the end of 4 months, I was like, I'm not going back to San Diego.
That's great. Well, I just came back from 10 years in Amsterdam. We thought it would be 3. Ended up buying a canal house from 1661, redoing it. You never know in life. I think it's wonderful to have a privilege of living outside of your native land. And you get a different view of the world. It's great.
I wasn't sure when I saw your name. I wasn't sure if you were Dutch or not, because when I saw that you had spent a lot of time there, I wasn't sure.
No, I'm not Dutch. The name is a shortened version of a long Russian name, shortened at Ellis Island with my immigrant grandparents. Mine
is shortened from once and a long time ago. It was Lithuanian. Kovielauskas to Kovaleski to Covel.
Oh, wow. Well, this is also Lithuania. It was from Vilnius in Lithuania.
Same. Vilnius as well. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.